Redditors who worked at defunct stores Blockbuster, Circuit City, etc. When did you realize they were done for? Story 1. I worked at Blockbuster. I was there when they started Blockbuster Total Access to compete with Netflix. You add movies to your account, they mail the DVDs to you, you can return the DVDs to any Blockbuster. As soon as they scan them in, you'll get the next movies on your list sent out, so you didn't have to wait as long for turnaround. Even better, you were able to rent a movie at the Blockbuster for free that you turned it in at. It was actually a great service. You could get tons of movies, and it was really easy to get people interested in signing up for it. Foot traffic in stores increases. The amount of candy and snacks we sold increased. We even had an uptick in paid movie rentals for non-new releases cause parents would exchange their movie for a new release and get a couple for the kids as well. Then they started to change it, restricted the amount of movies you can exchange each month. Different plans had different restrictions on what movies you could get, how many new releases, etc. It became really difficult to explain to customers because there were so many restrictions in place. After a bit you couldn't exchange a movie in store at all. Foot traffic died again and the chain along with it. Story 2. Walden Books. When one of 2 registers caught fire, the fire department put it out, but rather than pay to haul it away the company left it, a hulk of melted plastic where it was at the checkout. The store closed 2 weeks later. Story 3. Worked at Best Buy for a while, got fired and then went to work at Circuit City. I knew it the second I walked into that store. 6 months later we were told it was closing. Best Buy constantly updated fixtures and layouts designs. Everything was bright and new. I imagined that Circuit City looked exactly like it did when it first opened. Story 4. I worked at Babies R Us for 3 years. 4 part-timers. Our hours would fluctuate based on sales from the previous weeks. If we had a bad week, as much as 75 of us would get called off future shifts. It was so random. I could have 10 hours one week and 34 hours the next. It felt like the employees were not the only ones living paycheck to paycheck. Story 5. Worked at a Hollywood video. When there was a solid week with less than 10 customers, I knew it wasn't going to last. Luckily it was just my job for while I was in college. Story 6. Former CompUSA employee. The speed at which they started changing the slogan increased. They introduced and rescinded a rewards loyalty program inside of 6 months, and they started pushing bait and switch selling tactics in our monthly store meetings. I handed in my resignation the day before they announced the company closing. Story 7. I worked in the warehouse at Sears in college until 2007 when I graduated. We were regularly running out of inventory, and everything seemed like it had to be ordered in on a case-by-case basis. I was the person in the back that loaded the toolboxes, treadmills, snowblowers, etc. into vehicles. When you're running out constantly of your top revenue-generating pieces, something isn't right. Also, they didn't even bother updating inventory. I had a friend there that walked off with a couple of big screens and nobody ever even noticed. Story 8. I worked at Lone Star Steakhouse. There's not too many of them left anymore. If any, I worked an open-to-close shift one night, by myself, had 2 tables and made $12. I started a career elsewhere shortly after that, and 6 days after I left Lone Star for the new position the restaurant closed. The employees weren't told either. They showed up and the place was shut down by corporate already. Edit did some follow-up research. Last one in the US closed in October 2019, still one running apparently in Guam of all places. Guess I'll have to plan a visit. Get me a Texas Rose. Second edit. The Lone Star Grill franchise in Canada is not the same as Lone Star Steakhouse in America. Just found that out. Story 9. I worked for Borders from 2000 to 2008. When I was laid off I was working what had originally been 3 job descriptions. They decided to eliminate that position too and dump all the work on my already overworked boss. Called it restructuring and other corporate weasel words. But I could see the ship was sinking. Still missed that place. Story 10. This was family-owned restaurant, not a chain, but I knew they were done for when I quit. In my entire time there I only remember feeling like it was really truly busy a couple times. More often than not we were slow, or completely dead. The owner made some foolish decisions. He would frequently give the regulars free food and beer. It was also a microbrewery. Since I was just the peon dishwasher, I was usually tasked with closing the kitchen solo because me being there 3x as long when 2 people get it done in half the time makes total sense. Half the time when the owner was bartending he would have me turn the deep fryer back on to make free for his friends. Hooray for having to stay another hour just to cost the owner money. There were people in the front of house and back of house dating. Drama always ensued. There were people that hated each other forced to work alongside each other. Poor direction from the top down. The owner would allow his wife to wait tables when she was high off her face on pills. Before I worked there she got a DUI and had her license revoked. When it was reinstated he bought her on credit a brand new 60K Mercedes. She totaled it while drunk roughly a week later. I had 2 paychecks bounce. Good waitstaff didn't stay. The morning crew for the kitchen trickled out over a few months. I quit in January 2008. It was closed by May. Story 11. I worked for a Kmart in the early 2000s when the chain was starting to die a long, slow death. This location was a total shitshow. The store itself was dirty. In an unrenovated and outdated sort of way. My first day of death, I saw a bulletin about how a secret shopper had asked an associate for help and he told her to F off. Training was a joke, and it was super easy to swap up so goods could be purchased for other prices. As long as the prices weren't too high. Not that the dullard cashiers would have noticed. By far the worst area in the store was the warehouse. There was never enough item stock when there was a blue light sale and customers got pissed. But other than that, items were incredibly overstocked because Kmart didn't give a. There were huge boxes blocking the warehouse aisles, so I literally had to climb over piles of haphazardly stacked stuff. I quit that job after I decided that I wasn't going to break my neck for minimum wage. The only amusing thing about this job was that Pokemon had started to become wildly popular in the United States, and Kmart had these little Pokemon plushies kind of like Beanie Babies that were just kept on bins and shelves, so of course these things ended up all over the store due to little kids. I did cleaning and store tidying tasks, so I really did have to catch 'em all. Edit. I reread my comment and realize that I have the word death in where I should have had work. I don't know how it happened, but that is hilarious, so it's staying in. Story 12. I worked at a Radio Shack in college. I knew they were done for before I even applied. I just needed some pocket money for weed and a WoW subscription. Story 13. I worked for Kodak in the mid-1990s. Digital photography was emerging, but emulsion chemical photography was already moving to minilabs, away from wholesale mass production. Management were always talking down digital and talking up our long-term future. Kodak even brought out a new film format in about 1995, with a magnetic strip on the film. High-tech mate. Among workers, most felt we were doomed, but equally most of the older people, and many had been there 20 or more years, seemed to think they'd be okay for a few more years. Our CEO used to come and give speeches about how we had a future as long as we did not seek pay rises. He later became CEO of Telstra, Australia's largest telecommunications company. There, he made expensive takeovers of White Pages, the Paperphone Directory, and Trading Post, a classified ad newspaper. This was with the internet already in common use. He later became head of NBN Co., the quasi-government company responsible for building the country's high-speed broadband network, a much criticized, mismanaged project noted for complacency and lethargy, and a lack of ambition. There are some who want a nuclear power industry in Australia, and the man's name is often mentioned to head that. Story 14. I worked at Blockbuster, but I quit a few years before they finally bit the dust. Probably we could tell that they were going under when they started chasing Netflix and copying them rather than trying to find a way to actually do something new. Of course, plenty of employees on I Hate Blockbuster swore they saw it coming for years. Also, when nobody could get a decent manager to stay on, that was a pretty big red light. Story 15. My startup went under, but here were the signs. The only work was busybody work assigned by bosses and not coming in from the queue. We missed payroll 1 week. We asked when we were getting shut down. They said everything was fine. Bosses had locked door meetings for 2 weeks and were cunts to everyone during that time. ROF reduction of force started 2 months after the first payroll miss. The company is now completely shuttered. My boss's CEO, CTO, HR manager were idiots and had this wild plan of selling the company with no product or revenue. We tried pitching alternatives and driving revenue so that the company would succeed, and we were talked down to at every opportunity and told we know nothing about sales or running a successful company. Story 16. I worked at the Discovery Channel store in a mall around 2007, had huge 30 to 40K sales days during the holidays. Then come January some days were less than 500. I read an article that the then new CEO of Discovery Communications was considering ending retail sales. Found a new job shortly thereafter, and about a month later heard from some co-workers that they were shutting down. It was a fun place to work, and they had a few cool products, but most was overpriced garbage, and certainly not a sustainable business. Story 17. My owner started printing news articles about Netflix slowing down deliveries to folks who rented too much and posting them on our video store's entrance door. Story 18. Worked for Hastings back in 2013 while they were just starting the Spiral. The biggest problem at that time that I could see as a lowly front desk supervisor front desk lead was that the system for ordering items was about 20 times slower than just going online to Amazon and ordering it. You'd pay $2 more, but it got to you in 3 days tops. There was probably more, but that was a big piece that stuck out to me back then. Story 19. I didn't work for one, but I could see Borders bookstore going down when Barnes & Noble came out with a Nook after Amazon had Kindle. Borders missed the boat. It's too bad because I like Borders better than Barnes & Noble. Story 20. I got a job at Sears. I figured out they were definitely dying because I was getting a whopping 4 hours a week, 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Left me plenty of time to find a full-time job, and when I did find a decent job, I just stopped showing up to Sears. My manager called me asking if I really wanted to give up this job, and that I needed to carefully consider my options. I told them that I has weighed my options, and my new job gave me 10 times the hours, and nearly twice the pay. Story 21. I worked at Qualix Kodak 1 Hour Photo, Blockbuster, Steve & Barry's, Caribou while they still exist, it's only just barely, and they've contracted a lot, Saturn, and a few others that no longer exist. Funnily enough, it was never on the downswing while I was there mostly. Anyway, I should have companies pay me not to work there. Story 22. Not a store, but a .com. I knew we were doomed when management decided to buy a whole load of expensive IBM servers to host clients' websites, just as the national telcos were starting a hosting price war. Paying for those things' running costs which brought in zero revenue was a millstone too big for a 20-person company. We would have been fine if we'd just continued to deliver award-winning websites and digital media. Story 23. I worked for a Toby Keith's. I love this bar and grill. The entire corporate end of that business was a money laundering front, or something to that end. Turns out that the guy who ran it was actually a former monster who had went into witness protection, but continued to run a scam. I knew we were closing when the Tiltbag in Houston made it to 95 completion but never opened. That sparked several lawsuits, which resulted in several more Tiltbags closing, and the process continued till it reached Cincinnati. Our location was right between the two stadiums and was in a brand new entertainment district. As this all was happening, first our heat went out in the winter, and they were never able to fix it, then summer hit, and the AC went out, and they flat out just didn't even try to fix that. Our last week open was when the Reds were hosting the All-Star game. Most of us knew we were closing at any moment. And those who made tips made out like bandits. The last night was the All-Star game as we closed. A few of us rolled out one of the empty whiskey barrels that served as tables there and loaded it into an employee's truck. The GM swore we would be open the next day, but had disappeared that night and were nowhere around at closing. The next day, I walked up to a door that was chained shut and a notice from the city. None of the hourly employees were paid their final 2 checks. Until about 2 years later after a class action was filed, they still only got a fraction of what they were owed. What a wild ride though. Some highlights: minus 42 different managers and no less than 10 GMs in 3 years. The leaking AC unit that had a continuous stream falling for months about 6 inches from a circuit box in the electrical room. Seeing Toby Keith play an impromptu, drunken 2-hour set of classic rock with a house band that night. Story 24. Not exactly a store, but I worked at a drive-in in high school. When the owner told me I could eat all the candy, hot dogs and popcorn I wanted, I knew he was going out of business. Story 25. I remember working at Blockbuster around 3 or 4 months before they shut our store down. My coworkers were all zany and gave 0, all the way up to management. When the ship started going down, the interview process was such a joke because it involved 2 parts: a group interview and a one-on-one. The group portion involved us gathered around a bargain bin of movies, and each of us had to pretend to recommend one of the shitty movies in the pile as if a customer would really be going through that garbage. Then in the one-on-one, they basically asked if you were comfortable working any holiday they asked, and if you didn't mind cleaning the toilets. The actual job was a joke. Because Blockbuster was bought by Dish Network, they assigned 1 or 2 of us to come in and try to sell cable services to innocent people who just wanted to rent the Lincoln Lawyer. I made 1 sale and they never even ponied up the commission they promised. Instead, they let me keep a box of movies and games that I had stashed. Every employee had a safe spot for their box of the best stuff. Once they heard the store was closing, the managers who had been through the ringer before informed us of the protocol. Towards the end, literally everything became available for sale: DVD racks, weird promo character cutouts, and a freezer for ice cream. Eventually I'd come in, eat a Slim Jim off the counter and drink a brisk iced tea, and wait for the hours to die. When the store closed, all of us had a bonfire where we burned all of that got left over. 1010 best college job ever. Story 26. I briefly worked at Kmart after my family moved to a new state. It was readily apparent that higher management was just trying to minimize their expenses until the stores were forced to close, so they could have the largest post-bankruptcy payday they could muster. It was sad too because most of our customers would tell us how much they loved us over places like Walmart. If they had decided to invest in Kmart and actually gave it could have made a comeback and been a decent competitor. Story 27. I worked at a Sears as a temp holiday appliance salesman around the time corporate was closing down its first massive waves of stores. I think the biggest writing on the wall was that they apparently changed their commission structure around the time I got there. Asking the other salesmen who have been there for years, I learned that with the new system, you basically make about 30 less than the compensation system they had prior, which in itself was also less than the last system a year prior. Our orientation included someone from corporate going over how amazing Sears is, and how great it's doing. About a year or so later that store closed. I only really worked there for 2 months. Story 28. Circuit City. All the talk is we might be going under. Management says don't worry, it was only the Midwestern stores. New England is fine. Week later I found out on the news, couple hours before my shift started, that I no longer had a job. They let us work another month to liquidate, but had no keys to the building and had to be escorted in and out. Story 29. It's not defunct at this time, but I worked for Pier 1 in the 90s and more recently as a holiday job. In the 90s we opened a fair number of credit cards, but JN 2018 we were instructed to politely hound people about opening a credit card, which I hated doing. I don't know if they're done for, but it's rough out there in brick-and-mortar retail. There was much more sense of a solid business in 1998. Story 30. CompUSA. I was working in business sales and could just tell the company was on shaky ground. I started asking my customers about what was going on and one complained about low-level IT tasks he had to do. I said I could do them, sent him my resume, and 12 years later I'm still in IT, eventually got his job too. Story 31. My friend used to work at Circuit City in high school. Management literally never paid attention to anything. We stole hundreds upon hundreds of dollars worth of stuff from there without anyone ever noticing. When they did inventory, my friend said they had $400,000 worth of shrink. $400,000. When he said that they were one of the better stores when it came to shrink, I knew they were doomed. I think they went out of business about 3 to 4 years later. Story 32. Worked at Sears Auto Center back when I was in college in 2008. I knew they were done for as soon as I started working there. Writing was on the walls, they were always losing money and stock was always limited. Articles we released year after year how they were top 10 companies to go out of business. I didn't care, it was a steady paycheck for a simple job while I was getting through college. Story 33. When I worked at Radio Shack maybe 10 years back, we were encouraged to rip people off. It got to the point where both our manager and district manager would discipline us if we didn't rip people off while they were around. There were a few ways they wanted us to do it. First, if somebody came in to upgrade a cell phone and they didn't speak English well, which was a lot of our customers due to our location, we were told to change their plan without telling them, since the customers never read the contracts before signing them. So the bosses wanted us to change the plan to a family plan and add lines, or change the amount of minutes data they had, whichever seemed easier to get away with at the time. Then when the customers came back in a month or two to ask about the higher bills, our bosses wanted us to pretend we couldn't understand them, and say they needed to go to another store where employees spoke their language. I personally saw our manager and multiple sales associates do this. I got reprimanded constantly for refusing to do it myself. Another thing our manager encouraged us to do was sell iPod touches as iPhones to tourists. Our store was in a mall near an international airport, so we had a lot of tourists who would stop by to spend money on electronics that were cheaper here than in their country. At the time, iPhones were only sold at Apple and AT&T stores, but we had iPod touches that looked exactly the same. So sometimes you could sell them at a marked up price, add $200 to $300 to the listed iPod Touch price, then split that between the manager and yourself. There was also something my manager used to do, but I never saw or heard of any of the associates doing. When somebody would come in to buy a laptop that had multiple models that looked the same, he'd sometimes swap the boxes. So let's say we have a 500 laptop and a 1000 laptop that look the same, and somebody who seems clueless comes in to buy the 1001, he'd put the 500 one in the box and sell that instead. Then he could buy the expensive one in the less expensive box with our employee discount, which I believe was 10 on laptops, which he could sell for probably $800 on eBay or Craigslist. There were lots of little things they wanted us to do in order to raise our daily sales figures. We were all expected to do 2K a day in sales, regardless of how many hours you worked. We were watched closely by our district manager, since we were in the top 10 for sales in the company. I ended up having to quit because I kept getting into arguments with the higher-ups over refusing to do anything bad, but they wouldn't fire me because I was almost always the second highest in sales for our district, just behind one of my coworkers that gladly ripped people off. I was so happy when they went under. Story 34. Worked at Hastings in college, prior to them shutting down. Might be known on the coasts, but it was a bigger Midwest chain with movie rentals like Blockbuster, games, Magic the Gathering, books, crafts, RC planes, etc. They slammed like a Best Buy, Barnes & Noble, Blockbuster, and Hot Topic together basically. We got a new CEO, and at our staff meetings they would play a video from them, once or twice a year. I remember him saying aggressive marketing and then talking about doubling the number of stores in a year's time. They even took one of our managers for this special promotional project where a bunch of the highest performing managers from around the country were brought to Texas to open a Hastings in 48 hours, which sounded like a nightmare. Anyways, they went up like 6 months after that. I had been doing a summer internship, so I just got a letter with a check for like $560 as my company bankruptcy severance or whatever. Story 35. Worked at a Sears in HS in college. Overall it was a good job, but it was obvious that company was too diversified selling clothes, mattresses, etc., and was too stuck on an old department store business model with tons of huge locations in tons of suburban malls. Had they scaled back on location selection, focused more on in-store appliance tool sales, and gotten ahead in the online marketplace, they could still be doing well today. Story 36. I worked at KB Toys from 1998 to 2003. It was doomed the moment Bain Capital bought them. When it happened, no one knew who Bain was, but let me tell you, we learned quick that none of them had a clue as to how to run a business. They literally bought something they had no idea what to do with, wasted good money on stupid things, and then slashed-burned the moment things got rough. Fun fact that no one knows about: upper management at Bain demanded employee discounts at our stores. So yes, Mitt Romney had a KB Toys employee discount card. Theirs were fancy and said Bain Capital KB Toys, but it had our numbering system on it and served the Dame function. Story 37. I work at GameStop now. Hours are being cut, pay is very low and raises are little to none. Stock prices are in the gutter. Holidays are not crazy busy and stores are filled with junk. We are being pressured to sell warranties like you wouldn't believe because it's basically free money. People are being fired left and right for not selling enough of said warranties and memberships. Moral is in the dumpster. Our number one focus is getting people to trade in phones, not sell games, so the company can sell them to whomever. The list goes on and on. Story 38. Redbox. There was barely any room inside, and people kept trying to give me burned DVDs of Warriors of Virtue covered in syrup instead of whatever they had actually rented. Story 39. Tony Roma's. Not surprised they're all closing considering most have incredibly dated interiors from the 1980s and seem to only cater to the elderly. Their food is also really gross and way too expensive for the quality you get. I worked there one summer in 2009, and even back then I knew Tony Roma's would die the moment its clientele did. Swiss Chalet is another one that I see on its very last legs. Story 40. Not an employee, but when Blockbuster declined to buy Netflix for what would have been a pittance compared to its stock price, now I knew they were done because they were stuck in the past and too complacent. Story 41. I worked at Blockbuster Canada in 2009 and just got promoted to shift leader. That lasted just over a year. I got 3 promotion for mass selling our rewards program to customers, which was a combination of free rentals and coupons for frequent visits. Another part of that was the monthly pass, which would let you rent unlimited non-new releases as many times as you wanted, provided you returned the last movie. I think it was early 2010 when Netflix arrived in Canada, and I slowly lost some of my friends in neighboring stores due to closures. Our district manager told us to tell customers we were restructuring and simultaneously made all employees take a mandatory course in graph training which would teach you how to sell better. This didn't help whatsoever, and it was a last-ditch effort to survive. Customers would rub Netflix in our faces. I don't blame them, as you could pay less and not leave the house to watch multiple movies. Also, the convenience of digital to physical media was a nail in the coffin for the company. On top of that, I got yelled at frequently by customers regarding our no late fees policy. They would get charged a restocking fee after a week and I'd have to explain this stupid mismarketing to them. In October of 2010 we received the letter that our store in Toronto would be closing in 3 months and would be best to seek alternative employment. I bought so many of our own stock of movies and games during our liquidation week and never looked back. I still loved the job and the people I met there. 10 free rentals a week and discounted purchases, and food was great. Good times. Story 42. I was a new hire at a Kmart near where I used to live. When I was hired, Sears was already sinking. I knew that the store wouldn't be long if they couldn't separate from the parent company, but kept my hope up. After all, a burger chain had imploded a decade prior, but one store was an independent franchise and was and still is operating just fine. Fast forward a year and a half later, and I noticed people complaining about the MoneyGram machines not working. Then I saw the face of the pharmacist there. She didn't say anything, but she knew almost a month before they made the announcement. They moved the store manager, but told everyone else they could apply for the opportunity to work at another store. There were department managers who had been with the company for decades, and they were told they could apply at an open store if they wanted to stay with the company. I took my reduced hours, got picked up at a Best Buy across town, and walked away for the last time 2 weeks before they closed for good. I remember selling the money safe during that last week. It was surreal. Story 43. Tiavana. I didn't think it was over when Starbucks bought us, but it was when Starbucks raised their base minimum wage for all their employees, except Tiavana employees. It was super publicized when this happened, but we were blatantly left out even though all our paperwork said we were employees of Starbucks. I was an assistant manager at the time and was told by corporate to lie to my employees and tell them that the raise was coming even though no raise was ever planned. That's when I knew and started an exit plan. On the bright side, I have a fuckton of tea in my cabinet that I didn't pay for end of night shrinking out, so that's cool. Story 44. I worked for Blockbusters for years back in late aughts. We were a large store with a huge selection of stock. As an employer you got free rentals. I knew we were done for when my manager started using the company postal account to mail his Netflix DVDs back. Edit just to clear up the pre-postage thing. The postal account was just a predetermined timed pickup each day from the postal worker from our store, usually used to send broken DVDs back to the distribution center, but we used to use it for personal mail. Every so often the service was the more convenient for him to post his items back. It wasn't to not pay the postage. Story 45. Worked at Macy's for a year. Obviously they are still around, but not doing too well. You think it's a coincidence that you can never find an employee to check out. No, it's because they can't afford to keep many people on. Story 46. I worked for Walden Books for 5 years from 2005 to 2010. Walden Books was owned by Borders and had been systematically closing them over the years. We knew our store was on the chopping block because of our location. When the word finally came, it was not much of a surprise to us. We even got a severance package. What the shitty thing was, a year later Borders went under and many people went without their last 2 paychecks. I was thankful to get out when I did. It did not pay well, but I loved working with books and talking about books with people. It was by far my favorite job I have ever had, but boy was it financially painful. Story 47. I had only recently started working at Mervyn's and was ringing up a lady who started saying how sad she was that Mervyn's was closing down. And I was like, we're what? Story 48. I worked at Blockbuster in the early 2000s. When Netflix came out, we told our district manager how they mailed DVDs directly to your door and asked what she thought. She said it was a joke and wouldn't last the test of time. She also couldn't let go of her white snake groupie look from 1988. Story 49. I worked at Circuit City in computer sales from 1999 February 5, 2003. I was near the top in sales for the region. The managers were all made to attend a special retreat in which they couldn't bring their phones. It was previously clear Circuit City had lost its way and was throwing everything it could at it. Multiple store redesigns, commission changes, etc. This retreat seemed very off. They couldn't bring their cell phones. The day the retreat ended, we were called and told to be at the store at 9 a.m. the next day. I had an exam at Temple U that morning and said no, can't do it. They were extremely insistent. I knew then and there what was going to happen. I cleaned out my locker that night. I refused to come in, took my exam, and got on the train. While on the train, a coworker called me crying. The top 5 people in commission were let go. That included me. I went directly to the store, handled it like a champ, and when they asked to clean out my locker, I told them I did it last night. Story 50. I worked at Circuit City. I knew they were done when Best Buy started selling CDs for $11.99, which was super cheap at the time. This got a lot of attention and made people like going there to shop instead of Circuit City. Story 51. First they cut back on the trucks. Used to be the guys could stop to get gas wherever with no worries about reimbursement. Then they could only get so much at a time. Eventually, only select employees were the only ones with a fuel card and they gassed the trucks at select gas stations. The office couldn't use paper willy-nilly any longer. We no longer kept a stock of printer paper or ink and would instead purchase some once we were totally out. Daily shipments became bi-weekly, eventually down to a truck once a week. Along with this, they cut inventory drastically. Eventually, they had nothing left to cut but people. Health insurance and Christmas end-of-year bonuses were our area thing long of the past, and no pay raises in 3 years was here to stay. But after they cut the inventory was when they cut away all the full-time employees. It was basically like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I could see it coming from a long way off. The people in charge didn't know what they were doing, and so spoke with the confidence of blind ignorance, and they were quite convincing. In the end, it turns out they'd never had plan, and it was indeed a train wreck. Story 52 worked at Lehman Brothers during the crash tech. There were waves of layoffs. Those folks got a relatively great deal, severance, outplacement, etc. Because it was Lehman Brothers, we all thought it wouldn't crash. Fold couldn't cut a deal and we all burned. People came in afterwards to print out copies of their resumes. Consultants didn't know if we were going to get paid or not. Ever since then, I've cultivated networks to keep an ear to the ground. One hand on the exit door, as it were. Me and my dad worked for an extremely large construction company. Think top 3 in the nation for our line of work. It came out that the big wigs had embezzled around $75 million and didn't lose jobs or were even prosecuted. Even after surviving the economic of 2008, we still had a ton of jobs and employees, but as soon as the big boss for our town jumped ship, most people followed. I knew as soon as the big guys knew it wouldn't last because they were cutting jobs instead of making things right. Story 53 I worked at Jeepers. Think Chuck E. Cheese with a couple of rides. I worked maintenance for rides games. First sign one day, the manager says that the overhead music is not working. I check out the sound system and everything is working fine, just no music coming through. I call the satellite radio company, not Sirius or XM, but a company that does music for stores and stuff, and tell them that the satellite radio is not working. They informed me that the company stopped paying the bill 6 months ago. Second sign a week later, Pepsi stopped delivering to us because the company stopped paying the bill 3 months ago. Last sign 2 days later, 4 people in business suits walk in with TJ Maxx badges and measuring tapes. They start walking around measuring walls and writing stuff down. A week later we got the news.